Okay, we are on.
Oh, we are on. Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. You are all welcome to join us to debate of our guest, Marcelo Ferraro. Before to giving the word to Marcelo, I would like to introduce you to our group of research. We are the COPALC group. COPALC means Penitentiary Colonization of Latin America and Caribbean. We are 4 researchers, 3 Brazilians and 1 French. Given to the circumstances of COVID-19 pandemic, our meetings and debates are taking place at the YouTube channel each 15 days. So we hope to meet you here for the meeting, for the next meetings. This presentation of Marcelo is part of our second cycle of conferences. COPALC has a full schedule of debates on penitentiary issues. You can find more information about us on our website, hypothesis.copalc.org. The link will be below at description. And you can make your questions and comments at the web chat, and we will read it at the end of presentation. So I'll give the word to Dirceu, who will introduce you to Marcelo. Dirceu is with you.
Thank you, Angela. I would like to thank Marcelo for kindly accepting this invitation and to say that the subject of his research is directly related to the questions that motivated the creation of the COPALC group. We value the transnational, comparative, and long-term approach, and I'm sure it will be a passionate presentation. I will quickly introduce Marcelo Ferraro and pass the word to him without delay. Marcelo Ferraro is a doctoral student in history from the University of São Paulo and a global fellow from Harvard University. He holds a law and history degree from the University of São Paulo, Brazil, where he also obtained a master's degree. His previous research on architecture and slavery in the Paraíba Valley analyzed the formation of the Brazilian slave class and state political and judicial institutions. Guided by Professor Rafael Marquese, he recently began to explore slavery and punishment in the Paraíba Valley and the Mississippi Valley as a comparative and integrative experience of institutional violence and enslaved and post-abolition societies in the 19th century Atlantic world. Thank you, Marcelo. You are welcome.
Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank Dirceu Ferreira and the COPALC members like Angela, Otávio, Samuel, for inviting me, for allowing me to present my research here, to debate with all of you. It is an honor to be here. I would like to share some slides so that you can have some images and some keywords on this presentation. Sorry, just a second. Let me try it again, because it disappeared from here.
Okay, no problem.
Here we go. There we go. Can you all see a big slide said slavery and violence in the making of criminal justice in Brazil and the United States?
Perfect.
Thank you so much. So I would like to thank again this invitation, this opportunity to be among you debating such important topics. Dirceu has done, I think, more than generously my presentation. So let me move on to my research itself. I would like to begin this presentation reading 2 poems. Negro Forro, Adão Ferreira. Adão Ventura. Minha carta de alforria não me deu fazendas, nem dinheiro no banco, nem bigodes retorcidos. Minha carta de alforria costurou meus passos aos corredores da noite de minha pele. A possible translation would be, my manumission papers gave me no farms, no money in the bank, nor twisted mustaches. My manumission papers sewed my steps to the night corridors of my skin. And also, Maya Angelou, Caged Bird. The caged bird sings with a fearful trill of things unknown but longed for still, and his tune is heard on the distant hill, for the caged bird sings of freedom. Both Adão Ventura and Maya Angelou speak of blackness, freedom, and prisons, metaphoric and real. This presentation will focus on the structural connections between slavery and institutional violence in Brazil and in the United States. More specifically, how slavery as an institution influenced the making of criminal justice in both countries. However, this is also the story of those who lived and still live with their steps sewed to the night corridors of their skin, and all the caged birds that sing of freedom. I respectfully speak today only as a historian. Hopefully my research can contribute for a broader understanding of the political choices from our past that led to our present dilemmas. I would like to begin telling you guys a little bit about the origins of my research, entitled The Political Economy of Punishment Under the Second Slavery, Slavery in Brazil and the United States. What do I mean here by the political economy of punishment? I'm a specialist on Atlantic slavery history. Mostly I study the history of slavery in Brazil and in the United States. However, my PhD research project was inspired by my experience in social sciences, especially my readings on the sociology of punishment and critical criminology that taught me to denaturalize the relation between crime and punishment. Therefore, my dissertation intends to be a total history of slavery, violence, and above all, institutional racism and state violence, focus on criminal justice. My purpose is to analyze patterns of slave resistance, slave criminality, private violence, and state punishment through time and space, including politics and the economy as important variables. As some of you might know, Loic Vacan has said that political economy of punishment would be the perspective of some Marxist intellectuals such as Rush and Kirchheimer that would analyze punishment in their connections, especially to the economy. That is not the same concept I'm using here. I speak of a political economy of punishment trying to bring not only the economy itself, but the full experience of politics and culture into the picture, so debating with the perspective of Loic Vacan also. My presentation is organized in 3 parts. Part 1 is entitled Slavery and the Law. Part 2 is entitled The Necropolitics of Slavery. And finally, Part 3 talks about the legacy of slavery after abolition. So let's begin by Part 1, Slavery and the Law. I would like to begin bringing some historic context here. This story could begin at one of the thousands of slave ships that left Africa and made racial violence an essential institution in the making of colonial Americas. However, I prefer to begin by describing this event, an event that could have changed the future of Atlantic slavery, including in Brazil and in the United States. In the late 18th century, the Saint-Domingue Revolution and the later independence of Haiti in 1804 signaled the end of colonial slavery. They opened an opportunity for the end of slavery across the Atlantic. However, the rising prices of cotton, sugar, and coffee created an opportunity for the expansion of slavery in the United States and in Brazil, precisely when they became independent nations that were building new state institutions, including their constitutional and legal systems. I would like you to pay attention to these 2 maps and realizing the one on the left presents the United States actually the south of the United States, and the darker the image gets, the bigger is the enslaved population. Right in the middle of this map, I do believe you can see Mississippi River and can see how much enslaved population was concentrated here. When we analyze the same map for Brazil in the 1870s, we can see how the countryside of Rio de Janeiro, Vale do Paraíba, Paraíba Valley, was also the most populated region meaning like enslaved people populating it. Why? Because this is the coffee frontier in Brazil. And why Mississippi Valley? Because that's the cotton frontier in the US. The expansion of cotton in the US and the expansion of coffee in Brazil, it happened at the same time Brazil and the United States were building their state institutions. And therefore, slavery became an essential experience in the making of state institutions. But I would like to talk more specifically here to you about slavery and the law. The Constitution of the United States of America forbade any form of cruel punishment. The First Amendments reinforced the due process principle and made the jury a symbolic liberal institution for the making of criminal justice in each state, respecting federalism in that country. Brazilian Constitution also forbade cruel punishment and imposed liberal principles on the making of criminal justice. Formally, both constitutions were based on the monopoly of violence principle, meaning the prerogative of violence should be exclusively performed by state institutions under the rule of law. In theory, both Brazil and the United States, by creating criminal justice police institutions, it was based on the principle that any conflict in society should be solved exclusively by the state and under the rule of law. Interestingly, none of these constitutions mention the word slavery or slave. But silence was not a virtue. Silence and euphemism were writing strategies that turned slavery into a constitutional right. Both constitutions, by silencing on the word slavery, created by the private property principle and other rights, a way to turn slavery in not only a material reality, but also a constitutional right. But let us focus on the contradictions between these constitutions and the making of criminal law and criminal justice itself. In the United States, slave codes were a colonial tradition. I mean, codes that were specifically for enslaved people, treating specifically the kind of crimes that could be committed by an enslaved person. So slave codes were a colonial tradition that was preserved after revolution, especially in traditional states such as Virginia, South Carolina, and Louisiana. In my research, I analyzed Louisiana and a little bit more specifically, Mississippi. And Mississippi was an exception. Mississippi had one unified code of law for both criminal law and civil law that unified crimes and rights for enslaved people, but also free people. And this is something different. And this could be considered a sign that this legal system was treating people as equals. And I anticipate it's not. Most violations committed by enslaved people were dealt within the plantations, under the domestic sovereignty of slaveholders. So now we start to see some of the contradictions. Most violations committed by an enslaved person were under the responsibility of the slaveholder. The owner was responsible for treating this case. And this means they could also use violence. So the monopoly of violence is not a monopoly anymore. But when a crime was committed by an enslaved person and brought to justice, they were usually sentenced to suffer corporal punishment, a type of violence that was formally forbade by the Constitution. Capital crimes such as insurrection, murder, and assault on white people, arson, and rape were punished by death. In most states, slave crimes were not tried by formal justice. They were tried by the slave courts, which were justices of peace, and a jury of freeholders, and that's it, an improvised court. But in Mississippi, interestingly, Mississippi's capital crimes committed by enslaved people were under the responsibility of the jury. So the jury would treat these cases, but I want you all to imagine what it means for an enslaved person to enter court and be judged by a jury that is supposed to be citizens judging citizens. But one of them is a black enslaved person, the other ones are white freeholders. Some of them, most of them, slaveholders. And that says something about this distorted version of the jury. But what about Brazil? In Brazil, the Portuguese legal traditions, ordenações manuelinas, ordenações filipinas, this Portuguese legal tradition unified the criminal law for enslaved people and free people. And so did Brazil after independence. National Congress approved one criminal code and one criminal procedure code for the entire country. Brazil was not a federal state. Most violations committed by enslaved people were also solved in the plantations under the lash of slaveholders. Most crimes were also punished by whipping, here again violating the constitutional prohibition of cruel punishment. Only murder and insurrection were considered capital crimes, punishable by death, and the criminal procedure did not differentiate enslaved people and free defendants in court. All capital crimes were tried by the jury. So far you can see some contradictions. Brazilian law seems to treat enslaved people and free people the same way, but this is not true. The jury is also the institution that judges most crimes. But even when the jury does so, it is still slaveholders being the jurors, while enslaved people are the defendants. However, in the 1830s, after a series of enslaved insurrections, Congress approved the special law of 1835 that accelerated court procedures and the capital executions for crimes committed by enslaved people against their owners, overseers, and their families. Still, they were under the responsibility of the jury. What does this mean? That even though there was a unified criminal code and a unified criminal procedure code, and it was used for both enslaved and free people, this special law made the legal procedures much faster and the capital execution also faster whenever a capital crime was committed by an enslaved defendant. I'm sorry, my cats just enter here and drop my papers, but this is fine. What's the consequence here? I would like you to realize some important characteristics of this criminal justice system and how slavery dealt with it. Slavery was an essential institution in the making of Brazilian and American criminal justice. And it framed in both constitutional and legal systems some of the most important rights, property and safety. Of course, these rights did not mean the same for free people and enslaved people. For the safety of free people and their properties, enslaved people were treated as domestic enemies. This is the expression that was used, domestic enemies. And their resistance to slavery was a capital crime, punishable by death. Despite the fact that both constitutions forbade cruel corporal punishment, this prohibition simply did not apply to enslaved defendants, and there was no law saying that the Constitution did not apply. This was just something that was supposed to be known. Therefore, for every enslaved person living under the constitutional regimes of the United States and Brazil, there was a permanent state of exception, a permanent state of exception under the rule of law. For all of them, the exception was the norm. But there's something else. Not only they were under this permanent state of exception in which constitutional rights were not applied, but also these legal systems, they allowed what was called, it's an euphemism, moderate correction, which means slaveholders and overseers in their behalf had the right to use violence to punish enslaved people. The private right to punish was something that slaveholders, owners had. Therefore, slaveholders had the prerogative of violence towards enslaved people. And what does that make of the monopoly of violence principle? This is what I mean by this slide. I entered it a little faster than I expected, I'm sorry. By talking about an oligopoly of violence, I mean, even though the state had the exclusive right, the exclusive legal prerogative of violence towards national citizens, enslaved people were under two sovereignties, the sovereignties of the state and of their owners. Enslaved people were submitted to an oligopoly of violence, since state institutions and slaveholders shared the right to punish them and shared also the responsibility for controlling these domestic enemies. The legal use of violence towards enslaved people was not monopolized by the state, but shared by the state and slaveholders, naturalizing violence as a class privilege and a racial prerogative of white people against black people. So I repeat myself, the oligopoly of violence, by sustaining the legal use of violence privately by slaveholders, it naturalized violence as a class privilege, but also as a racial prerogative that white people had on black people. Now, I would like to enter part 2 on my presentation that I entitled The Necropolitics of Slavery. Usually, Achille Mbembe perspective on necropolitics as the politics of death, the capacity of the state, but not only the state, choosing who dies and who doesn't as kind of a policy of death. By analyzing this policy of death, or the necropolitics of slavery, I will talk in the next slides about the biggest, more like specific findings of my research on slavery. Maybe not clear for those who are not familiar with bibliography, but I'll do my best to make it simple so that we can debate, which is the most important thing here. I will talk about patterns of slave resistance and state violence, how they changed through time, but also how Brazil and the United States were different. I would like to say first that I intend to do so by analyzing Mississippi Valley and Vale do Paraíba, as I have said, but more specifically, Adams County. I think you can see it right in the middle of the Mississippi Valley, one of the most important counties for cotton production. And in Brazil, more specifically, Vassouras, one of the major coffee cities in the countryside of Rio de Janeiro. These are the two major cities when it comes to the coffee frontier and cotton frontier, the coffee plantations and cotton plantations. I wasn't supposed to say this, but I can't control myself. There's another finding of my research that I haven't presented here formally, but I would just like to mention the fact that I'm not only analyzing public punishment from the state, but also private punishment. And even though slavery was always a system of labor and labor towards productivity to send commodities to the world market, I do believe that in the 19th century, there is a change. I do believe that industrial capitalism in the 19th century made violence in this specifically most dynamic agricultural frontiers, made violence more systemic. I mean, the relation between violence and labor productivity, disciplinizing the corpse, the bodies, so that they could perform labor in the best way. I do believe it is possible to say that even though private violence was always a mechanism of labor productivity through the history of slavery, it became more systemic in the 19th century. If anyone is interested, we can talk about this later. But I would like to frame the central methodology of my research, which was the analysis of capital crimes. I present here the capital crimes in Natchez, Mississippi, and the capital crimes in Vassouras, Rio de Janeiro. Natchez was at the core of the cotton frontier in Mississippi Valley since the beginning of the 19th century, and Vassouras was founded in the 1830s and became the most important region of the coffee frontier in Paraíba Valley, Vale do Paraíba. In both regions, there were new plantations, and these new plantations have new slaveholders, new overseers, and enslaved people brought by the slave trade recently from the north and the upper south of the United States and from Africa in Brazilian case. This means that in the first decades in each society, violence was a result of what I'm calling here a recent plantation society or this frontier society. But I want you all to notice that there is a pattern here. Capital crimes as a symptom of slave resistance were higher in the beginning. They decreased in the 1840s in the US, in the 1850s and 60s in Brazil, and they rose again in the 1850s in the US and in the late 19th century in Brazil. I want you to keep in mind this movement because that's what I'm going to try to explain. Is it possible that slave resistance changed through time? Is it possible that the state changed its way of criminalizing certain behaviors? Is it possible that state intervention was higher in certain periods than in others? This is what I will try to explain to you in the following slides. Between 1825 and 1837 in Natchez, there were at least 9 capital crimes committed by enslaved defendants. Trials and public hangings were frequent, taking place at least every 2 years. However, between 1838 and 1849, there was only 1 case, and the defendant was hanged discreetly in jail. So the public death penalty disappears. The number of cases diminishes. What about Brazil? Between 1835 and 1848 in Vassouras, there were 8 capital crimes, including 1 insurrection and 1 conspiracy. At least 9 men were hanged. However, between 1849 and 1869, there were only 3 capital crimes. And the last hanging in Brazil, in Vassouras, was in 1856. How can I explain that also in Brazil, hangings would happen so often at first, and then they would become so scarce in the 1850s and 1860s? I try to present now an interpretation. This first period in both societies, I'm calling the commodity and state frontier. Well, the agricultural frontiers were recently established slave societies, and the rising prices of cotton and coffee led slaveholders and overseers to impose higher pressure on labor productivity. Some enslaved workers resisted. So, one first explanation is, in a frontier society, conflicts over slavery in the plantations connected to the rising prices in the world market creates tension, and from tension, violence, and therefore capital crimes. But this is not enough, because if I follow the steps, I would be naturalizing the relationship between crime and punishment. It is important to analyze also politics and how politics interfere in the justice system. During the political crisis of the 1830s in both countries, anxieties led the free population and authorities to use the jury and death penalty as an instrument of the slave order. And they also performed extra-legal violence beyond the justice system, especially during insurrectional scares after slave conspiracies were discovered. So this was an extremely violent period, and in my opinion, both because of economic pressures, but also because politics over slavery were somehow unstable, and because of that, state violence, but also extra-legal violence was intense and frequent. But let's reach the second phase. So why do capital crimes diminish? And why is the state not performing the public death penalty anymore in both countries? The economic deceleration of the 1830s in the US and the 1850s in Brazil lowered the pressure on labor productivity. The slave trade decreased, and slave families and communities were established. This marked the emergence of what I'm calling here a mature slave society, or 2 mature slave societies, in which slaveholders, overseers, and the enslaved population negotiated unwritten rules. Here I'm following the steps of other historians that have been presenting the fact that the stronger slave families and slave communities, the stronger they are, the better they are the more capable they are of negotiating the conditions of life and labor with overseers and slaveholders. So it is possible that slave resistance decreased or it changed to negotiations. However, it is fundamental to understand that the political stability in both countries during this period was based on a silent consensus over slavery inside state institutions that blocked the anti-slavery agenda. What am I saying here? These periods, they were periods of political stability in both countries, and therefore the controversy over slavery was not that intense. Therefore, it is possible for the state to present itself as more civilized, avoiding that public violence become a symptom of a barbarous institution. Conflict might have decreased. The economy pressure on labor might have also decreased. Conflict might have been solved at the plantation itself. This is all possible. But I do believe it is fundamental to understand that political stability allowed the justice system to present itself as more civilized, even though it was a criminal justice in a slave society. So I present a theoretic premise that I had before this research, but that was reinforced by my findings. It is fundamental to denaturalize the relation between crime and punishment. Patterns of violence, and especially institutional violence, must be understood in relation to the economy and politics. But this brings us to the most important phase of my research, what I'm calling here the crisis of slavery. This final period was a period in which slave resistance increased. This is a fact. Slave criminality also increased. And this is a moment when the oligopoly of violence has a crisis. Why? Because state institutions would still punish enslaved people who resisted, but not with public hangings all the time, because the justice system was trying to become more civilized for the 19th century standards. The consequence is that there is a struggle between the formal justice and extra-legal violence. The rising prices of cotton in the 1850s and of coffee in the 1870s increased the productivity on enslaved, the pressure on productivity of enslaved workers in the United States and Brazil, and intensified the internal slave trade in both countries. But this is still an economic and social situation. What I want to include here is, at the same time, the political struggle over slavery did affect the plantation, and enslaved people felt encouraged to resist as if they could end slavery themselves. The rise of radical abolitionism increased the political significance of slave resistance. Therefore, slaveholders and state institutions reacted. Violence became epidemic. I do believe slave resistance increased during the crisis of slavery in both countries. I do. However, I also believe that state violence and extra-legal violence were a disproportional reaction to political dissent, not to the fact that they could immediately lose control of their society, but because the horizon of abolition made slaveholders panic. I would like you to see these two slides now. I want you to see the fact that this is Mississippi first, Adams County. In Mississippi, the death penalty frequency was proportional to capital crimes over the decades. In the 1850s, the criminal justice became harsher and the specter of public hangings returned. So in the end of the 1850s, public hangings again. During the Civil War, the anxieties of the white people emerged after rumors of insurrection, and criminal justice was substituted by slave inquisition. What do I mean? Even though state punishment and the criminal justice became harsher in the late 1850s, by the time the Civil War began in the United States, there was this perspective that only the most intense and the most arbitrary form of violence could control society. Extra-legal violence became epidemic with informal trials, confessions under torture, and the hangings of at least 50 and at most 209 enslaved men and women between 1861 and 63 in 2 or 3 years. State punishment and extralegal violence were not simply the result of increasing criminality. They were political answers to political tensions. They were rituals of power over enslaved Black bodies, a legacy that prevailed after the abolition of slavery. Now I would like you to follow my steps watching Brazil, and I want you to realize this. Brazil was different. The death penalty was not proportional to capital crimes in Brazil. It decreased in the second half of the 19th century. But if enslaved people are resisting more, if slave criminality is rising, how to explain the fact that the death penalty is not being applied anymore? This was the result of the emperors, Dom Pedro II, but not only him, also some politicians, and their strategy to present Brazil as a civilized nation despite the continuity of slavery. They could not end slavery, so they could at least avoid the death penalty. In the 1870s and the 1880s, during a new coffee boom, social tensions in the plantations resulted in higher criminality and trials. The political significance of slave resistance increased after the rise of the abolitionist movement, and the extra-legal reaction of slaveholders and overseers also became epidemic. And now I would like you all to follow me. Lynching spread through the coffee zones of Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo, and Minas Gerais. When we talk about lynching, we usually picture the United States of America. I'm saying that in the 1880s and in the early 1890s, Brazil had lynching as an experience, and racial lynching. Most of Black people who have committed capital crimes, but also later of Black men who would approach white women. And this is quite similar to the United States of America. State punishment and extralegal violence in Brazil, they were not simple reactions to the rise of criminality. They were also political answers. They were power rituals of slaveholders over enslaved bodies. In Brazil and the United States, slaveholders became hysteric when their world crumbled. I would like to move on. I know this has been, at the same time, maybe too long, but also fast in the way I talk, but we have the questions. I would like to enter my last part in this presentation, entitled Abolition and the Legacy of Slavery. By the late 19th century, slavery had been abolished in the entire American continent. Slave resistance and radical abolitionism played a major role, both in Brazil and the United States. The Civil War promoted a violent abolition of slavery in the United States, but it is important to demystify the abolition in Brazil, which was not peaceful. The legal abolition of slavery in Brazil, the Golden Law, a Lei Áurea, was a conservative response to the risk of revolution and an agrarian reform in Brazil. In the United States first, the 13th Amendment prohibited slavery in the United States, except as a punishment for a crime. In Brazil, the Golden Law, Lei Áurea, imposed an unconditional abolition of slavery. However, while freed African Americans experienced citizenship during Reconstruction in the United States between 1865 and 1877, Afro-Brazilians were immediately marginalized. But anyway, by the late 1890s, Black people in both countries suffered with poverty, disenfranchisement, and racial violence. Agricultural labor was an important issue in both countries, and anti-vagrancy laws, incarceration, and forced labor were legal strategies to control the freed population and to discipline workers to return to the plantations. Penitentiaries were built, and prison became supposedly the major form of civilized state punishment. But other carceral institutions were created and preserved even more the essence of slavery. In Mississippi and Louisiana, the convict lease system was the first solution. The state would lease convicted men to work on plantations. So this was a new form of slavery. Prisoners used as enslaved workers. But later they decided to create the famous prison farms, such as Angola in Louisiana, which still exists, not a prison farm anymore, but it's still a prison, and Parkman in Mississippi. In Brazil, penal colonies were built in Atlantic islands, such as Ilha Anchieta and also Ilha Grande, just two examples of São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. Forced labor and illegal corporal punishment were preserved as disciplinary technology as much as the carceral architecture of plantations. I just invite you to take a look at the penal colony of Ilha dos Porcos and see how it is the same, it has the same structure of an old plantation. And I invite you all to watch the workers in Parkman prison farm in Mississippi and how they were aligned the same way enslaved workers would work during slavery. But there's more. Legal and extra-legal violence would still be combined after abolition. In the United States, the death penalty was preserved. At first, within prison walls. Men would be hanged within prison walls. However, racial lynching spread through the southern states. So lynching became epidemic in the south of the United States. And how did authorities react to that? Instead of fighting and controlling popular justice, lynching, they decided to bring back the public spectacle of the death penalty. And men were fastly hanged as a form of state violence that performed the same ethics of lynching. In Brazil, racial lynching, the lynching of black men for being black men, it happened. It decreased after 1893. And the death penalty was abolished. And historically, Brazil has been using the fact that lynching here is not necessarily racial and it's not as epidemic. And the fact that Brazil doesn't have the death penalty to say, see, the United States have real racial violence and Brazil is supposed to be the racial democracy. The death penalty was only formally abolished in Brazil. Extra-legal violence towards black people was and still is systemic in Brazil. While racism and racial violence are more explicit in the United States, Brazilian society historically denies its racism and hides the racial motivation of our epidemic violence. Thousands of Afro-Brazilians are murdered every day in the racial democracy paradise, victims of nobody. I would like to end this presentation just saying that violence was indeed the essence of slavery. And my findings reinforce the idea not only that slavery was violent, because that's just obvious, but the fact that violence changed through time and space. And the changes were not exclusively the reaction to criminality or the reaction to the fact that like more people would resist, but also the fact that politics interfered in the justice system. As we know nowadays, economic and politics interfere with the logics of criminal justice. And therefore, the rising in the harshness of state institutions when they punish cannot be understood as a natural response to criminality itself, but as a political choice to perform the power over a certain part of the society. Well, I would just like to say that violence was indeed constitutive of slavery. It constitutes our past and also our present. Slavery was essential in the making of state institution and criminal justice in Brazil and the United States, and also in the making of these racial violent societies. The abolition ended slavery, but its legacy prevailed in lynching spectacles, segregation, inequality, and police brutality. More recently, mass incarceration. This is also our history, the history of our own dilemmas, our own peculiar institutions to be abolished. I would just like to remember, as I said in the beginning, that those who actually feel all of this violence are essentially African descendants in both countries. And they have also been the ones fighting this violence and these contradictions and the hypocrisy of our constitution and legal regimes. I would like to remember the fight of Angela Davis that fought in a different generation of the civil rights movement in the United States, but that has realized how prisons are central to understand racial violence and mass incarceration in the 21st century. But I'd like to remember that this fight has also been done by Afro-Brazilian and Afro-Brazilian women, for instance. One of them who identified in 2010 mass incarceration as racial violence in Rio de Janeiro, suggesting this law project. And that woman, as most of you know, has been murdered precisely for fighting racial violence and institutional racism in Brazil. And therefore, it's for those who actually suffer and fight that I dedicate my research. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcelo. Thank you. Beautiful presentation, beautiful analysis. I like the way you articulate economic history, political history, cultural history, and the continuities of this institution nowadays. It's certainly, this is very important for us to understand the panel colonization of the societies, of the American societies. So I had this expectation about your presentation, it is perfect. Well, before to pass the word to my colleagues, I would like to highlight how criminal law replaced slavery as a way of controlling the Afro-descendant population in the Americas. And for me, this is the most important information in your presentation. But for me, for my research, of course, the way you analyze the continuities of a colonial institution in a Republican state or supposed Republican state, and this is perfect for me. Wow. So I have just one question for you by now. It's a very simple question. How do you read Peter Beattie's thesis in Tribute of Blood that the army functioned as a proto-penal institution in the 19th century? Would this be an effect of the oligopoly of violence in Brazil, in your opinion? I would like to hear you about this thesis, because, well, again, this is very important to understand the transition for the Republican period. The Brazilian army passed through a reform in the beginning of the 20th century, in 1916, if I'm not wrong. But I would like to hear you about this role of the Brazilian army in controlling free laborers in Brazil, poor laborers in Brazil in the 19th century and in the beginning of the 20th century. And just a second question, sorry. How did notions like internal enemy, you remarked that this notion appeared in the 19th century? For me, this is new. And how did notions like internal enemy impact the Brazilian and the US legal codifications? I also would like to hear you about this little question. So I let you answer, or
you can all decide if you prefer to present a few questions and I take them and I answer all of them, or if I should take every 2 questions. You guys decide.
Well, you can respond. You can answer these questions, and then we open for.
Deal. So first of all, Giselle, these are amazing questions. Thank you for them. It allows me even to explain a little bit more some of my ideas. You brought Peter Beattie into the picture, and he's an amazing historian. I really like his work. I read the book you mentioned, but a long time ago, so I won't quote anything that I don't remember. But I would tell you this: I tend to agree that the army can be considered something like a proto-panel. I think that's the expression you use, a proto-panel institutions. And I wouldn't even like necessarily follow only Peter Beattie's steps here. I would even take steps back and talk about Foucault, because Michel Foucault would say that if we talk about like a disciplinary, like discipline as a form of power in the late 18th century and even in the 19th century, it was not exclusively, it was not exclusive to prisons and then to all society, but some specific institutions were fundamental in raising discipline as a new form of power. And one of the institutions he mentions is the army. So, and I would include something that Foucault mentioned in one article, but he didn't explore it. It wasn't his topic. I would also say that the slavery in the Americas was also fundamental in building disciplinary power that was later used for carceral institutions such as the prison itself. So I would say first, the army and prison, I think these institutions, it's not necessarily that one framed the other, but they were built under the same logic, in the same historic context. And I do believe the army had, as an institution, had the power of proposing discipline for those who were in it, but also the fact of how the army would recruit individuals. It makes the army also a social institution that brings discipline into society. So not only for soldiers, but also for the society itself. So I tend to agree. And I would say in Brazil in the 19th century, I believe not only the army, but also the Navy. As we know, the Navy was like, would use corporal punishment until 1910, until Revolta da Chibata. So I would say that these state institutions, and also the police, and also other carceral institutions, but mainly the plantation system, they were the major institutions responsible for disciplinizing people, and especially Black people in Brazil. So I tend to agree with you that Army and Navy would have this power. Like calling it proto-panel, I think it works, and it's a strong word. I like the way it sounds. But I think if we treat it as a disciplinary institution, it also does the work. It doesn't need to be penal, because I do believe plantations were not penal institutions, but they were also penal institutions, and they work that way. And if I didn't answer, you can bring it back. And about the second question, you mentioned like the internal enemies. They would say domestic enemies, which I find even more interesting. Because when you say domestic enemy, you're not only saying there is an enemy in the same country, like there is a group in society that is the state's enemy. It is more than that. The domestic enemy is the enemy inside the house, is the enemy in the slave cabins, in the slave quarters. So it brings the logic of the enemy not only within the state territory, but also within the slaveholders' domains, the way they would deal with their own plantations and their own houses and have enemies inside. And as we know, in the 20th century, there is, I might make a mistake translating the expression, but it's the penal law of the enemy. That is one expression, like the penal law of the enemy is the way criminal law in the 20th century chooses some specific individuals or groups in society that are treated the same way the army treats an outside enemy. So there's an inside enemy. And I do believe that the way Brazil and the United States built their criminal law as one extra institution to sustain order, and order meant controlling enslaved people, but also free black people, I think that played a major role. So I do believe that if nowadays we talk about a criminal logic of the enemy that drives the police and the prison system choosing internal enemies in Brazil, I do believe that definitely slavery played a role in making at least that this public enemy are mostly Black people, African descendants. I don't know if I answered it, and if other questions could come.
Yeah, can follow if you want, or Otávio, comment.
Yes. First of all, thank you very much for your brilliant presentation. Marcelo, you make an important observation in your presentation that refers to the fact that racism and racial violence in the United States has always been explicit, unlike Brazil, which has always denied its racism, as well as its racial violence. In this sense, according to your opinion, is criminal selectivity in the United States more explicit today than in Brazil? And what makes Brazil an extremely racist country find it so difficult to deal with this issue in a sincere way, contrary to what apparently occurs in the US? That's my question.
Otávio, thank you. This is a brilliant question. I would say that, as you can see, sometimes I exaggerate some arguments when I'm presenting it. What I meant is, I don't intend to say that Brazil has kind of this hidden form of racism and all racism in the United States is self-presented. I do believe institutional racism, structural racism is fundamental in the US. Actually, this was just a way trying to fight those arguments that in Brazil say, since we didn't have an age of racial lynching, explicitly racial, the fact that we don't have the death penalty to say that more Black people suffer this or that, like it makes it a little easier for this ideology of racial harmony, this ideology that denies racism, to hide the fact that Brazil is a violent country and violence has a specific victim. That is most of the time Black people. Social violence, but especially institutional violence. So you're absolutely right. I don't mean that, for instance, the selective form of criminal justice in the US is explicitly racist. A judge doesn't present himself racist when he incarcerates like 1,000 Black men. You're absolutely right. This moment of my talk, even though I wasn't careful enough, it was more an attempt to say racial violence in the United States and in Brazil, it is there. It just expresses itself differently. Both countries have a selective justice. Both countries have mass incarceration that victimizes, above all, Black people. The same thing with poverty, marginalization, and everything. It's all truth. But also, the fact that the United States had and still have specific racial groups that present the racial supremacy, the white supremacy discourse, this has helped people who deny racism in Brazil to use the United States to say, see, we're not racist. This doesn't exist in Brazil. And since this was a really interesting mechanism that Brazilians used, especially certain elites in the 19th century, to deny racism, I think it is important to frame our racism and our institutional racism and our structural racism, in my opinion, in Brazil, is much more effective than in the United States. Because in the United States, the way racism happens in the United States, it also allows the Black movement to fight it back and to use democratic institutions to show the contradictions inside the system. While in Brazil, Afro-Brazilians, the Black movement has been doing this for ages, but it's so difficult to make an agenda that convinces most of Brazilian society, most of like the national press, and most of intellectuals in this country. But I think your question had something else, which was, okay, but how do we explain these different forms of violence in both countries? And I would say that this has like a lot of reasons. I could get back to the colonial period again and talk forever, and I'm trying to avoid that. But I would say that demography in both countries are different. The original colonization allowed that in the United States, the line between white and Black was stronger, and it allowed that white supremacy discourse was built. In Brazilian society, there were racist people trying to talk about white supremacy, but it's much more difficult to use that when there's a society that's a mixed society with so much inequality through different like aspects to different groups. So I would say that Brazilian demography, Brazilian mixing, and I'm not trying to bring the racial democracy myth here, but the fact that Brazilian society is more mixed than the United States All of this created political conditions that in Brazil, sustaining racial inequality did not demand a discourse that openly talked about Black people being inferior. This happened, but this was not necessary. Brazil, in my opinion, created kind of a perfect racial supremacy in the tropics, because by denying racism and being the country that most victimizes Black people and still being capable of presenting itself as a racial democracy, this is everything any racist would want, not even need to defend racial supremacy to get it. And I do believe for cultural reasons, for demographic reasons, Brazilian elites, and especially authoritarianism in Brazil that sustained this racial myths in Brazil, I think because of all of that, Brazil was more effective in its form of racism.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you, man.
Well,
If you mean I can follow, or just say
no, I just would like to pay some attention in our colleagues, in our audience. Demian dos Santos said bonjour. Well, Direito, Café e Literatura, teacher Marcelo Ferraro. Your friends are here. And our colleague, our friend, Indaner Pareto Jr. So, Samuel, you have the word.
Thank you so much, Marcelo, for this very rich presentation, and which echoes so much to my work, actually. I'm just writing an article about like what I call abyssal borders of French Guiana. It appeals to, you know, to Sousa Santos' historiography and not historiography, actually epistemology. And I'm using quite much like necropolitics of memory in my corpus. So I'm working like so much in your direction, and I call like Dirceu the day you sent your plan, and it was so comparatively close to my own work. So very glad to hear you. I'm pleased because you are dealing with other spaces which share many intellectual tools, many ideology with French Guiana situation. But I mean, like we need to follow all the time Ballandier historiography, like colonial situation. You know, like in each colony you have your own parameters and your own colonial policy, and it's very interesting to see how much like in United States the penal colonies are used to penalize slaves. And in French Guiana, it's used to replace indigenous people and free colons, because there is a lack of this, and the society is led indeed by the free color people who are the like colonial intermediaries, very powerful in this colony, which is a desert actually, and where there is quite no white people to rule, you know. So the colonial situation is very interesting to deal with our subjects, and also I'm interested in how much, you know, the abolitions don't lead to freedom, didn't lead to freedom for slaves in all these colonial spaces, actually. In French colonial space, you have a very interesting thing, because we have two abolitions. The first in 1794, which is quite almost forgotten, but it's a very important moment, and we had a very interesting work from a colleague from French West Indies University, Thierry Urban, which is a law teacher and a law professor, and he's speaking about segregated citizenship, you know, like you have like in 95 the laws detailing how the slaves are going to be freed, and we are creating in France a very interesting thing like provisory citizenship, which is like all the Negroes are free and French citizens with citizen rights, but if they don't work and they don't participate to common effort, to common good, they lose their citizenship, which is like a very strange nationality law, you know. So we have this kind of things, and in 48, in the second abolition, we have like these hesitations in French Empire. It's like, how are we going to replace this with slavery world? And there was tentatives of engagement, penal colonies, so much varieties of work, but always constrained work, you know, like not free work, like salary as a common law is not a rule in the colonial world and the post-colonial world, and which leads to your main purpose, which is and concept, which is state of exception. And I would like to hear you about this, like defining for you and basing on historiography what means state of exception, because like colonial world is a word without law. I think it's Membe or Sousa Santos who said that. And I would like to hear about state of exception, because it's very directly linked to my work, and I would very personally would like to know much more about this. So thank you.
Samuel, thank you so much for your comment. I would like to know much more about your research. I know you also presented your research, if I'm not wrong, a few weeks ago. I couldn't participate because I was teaching at the same time. But like, it sounds like an amazing project, and it sounds like we are all dealing with similar topics. It's inevitable that by analyzing state violence, law, we are dialoguing with the same concepts, even though they might change from different social and cultural realities. When you talk about like the way the state would penalize like not only enslaved people, but also indigenous people, this is fundamental. And I would even say that like my research would be much more complete if I had had the time and capacity to analyze how the state also framed the criminal justice and the constitutional regime in Brazil, putting indigenous people into the picture. I am pretty sure that all the concepts I'm using, especially state of exception, not that much oligopoly of violence, but definitely state of exception, would perfectly explain the relationship between the state and indigenous people also in Brazil. And I do agree with you that when you mentioned by analyzing, if I understood it right, like by analyzing the colonial situation in your project, we can see how much like the colonial technologies, the colonial policies, how they survived through the end of the colonial period, and how they still frame the way the state, not only the state, but like the way a society is organized, and the way like abolition absolutely did not mean exactly freedom, or it meant only freedom, like a formal freedom, but actually not citizenship, a kind of freedom that can be experienced in a more like classic way. But I think you brought something fundamental. You mentioned Mbembe, like at the beginning, Aquilo Mbembe, which is fundamental for my research as well, even though I didn't talk much about him. But I do believe it is really important to talk about state of exception. I think, first of all, following Agamben's project, even Hannah Arendt and other intellectuals that use the concept of state of exception, I think it is important, first of all, to realize that all the legal system based on the liberal abstract principles, it is an abstraction. So when we talk about democracy, citizenship, monopoly of violence, these are all abstract principles. And we all know that in no country all over the world, it is possible that a state actually guarantees every right for every citizen. So even if we analyze democracies and traditional democracies such as the United States, Britain, France, we know that these democracies, even though more traditional, they do not guarantee the equal rights for its entire population. So first of all, it is important not to idealize what would be the perfect legal regime or the rule of law in an abstract and perfect way. But even though I do believe, following Agamben's step, that every society has a certain state of exception, I mean, there are specific situations or specific spaces in a society, the peripheries, or specific people, indigenous, black, in some cases women, that are not completely considered citizens with full rights. So they are somehow under a state of exception. I do believe this happens even in most democracies, but I do believe it is fundamental, not only to quote state of exception in our case, but to specify what a state of exception means in a country framed through colonization, slavery, who's actually not completely considered a citizen, who's actually not having their rights defended by the state. So by analyzing the concept of state of exception, I'm not trying to bring like a big statement. I do think like Agamben has done enough on that, but I do believe that maybe our role would be to use the concept of state of exception to illuminate which people, which situations, which regions of a modern society are not actually under the rule of law, not even abstractly. So they are under a permanent state of exception. Brazil has a permanent war happening in the peripheries. So we can't talk about rule of law in a country where there are so many spaces where the notion of rule of law makes no sense. And I do believe that by focusing on slavery itself and how the plantation as a space also, but not only the plantation, how migration for migration of freed people to the cities, to the peripheries, how it reframed the state and the spaces and the people who are submitted to this space, to this state of exception. I do believe I can talk about enslaved people in a state of exception in the 19th century. But the most important thing might be what Dirceu is doing here, which is analyzing how the state of exception is built after slavery. Because while slavery is there, it's legally there. So at least it is apparent. These people are not citizens. But what happens after a constitution says that supposedly everyone is a citizen, but they're not. So I do believe it is a legacy of slavery, but I do believe that to understand how the concept of state of exception works in the 20th century, it is fundamental to do what Dirceu is doing, analyzing how the republic did not mean democracy in Brazil, and how formal democracy never became material democracy for most people in this country, especially the African descendants.
Well, my turn. So thank you, Marcelo, for your impressive presentation. Before to make my comments and my question, I would like to remember our audience that you still have time to make your questions and comments at the chat. And well, Marcelo, you have a very interesting point when you point out that extralegal violence is pandemic and a permanent state of exception. It brings me to mind Walter Benjamin. But my question is linked to Otávio's question, but from another perspective, from the state perspective. You said that despite the rising of capital crimes, the death penalty had dropped in Brazil at the second half of 19th century. And you explained that like a kind of strategy to keep practice of slavery in Brazil, and you see that as very effective way to reach the Brazilian interest in keeping slavery. Could you say more about it, and what kind of speeches and mechanisms Brazil applied to support this strategy, besides a less application of death penalty? Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. This is a great question, not only because As you have seen, I am a little excited about my topic, so I try to talk about everything at the same time, and I just suggest some ideas and I leave them there. And if you get them, you give me the opportunity to explain myself a little better, and I thank you for that. I do believe this is one of the most interesting things I analyze in my research. I'm not the first one to do it. The analysis, the studies of death penalty and slavery in Brazil, like a bunch of historians have done that before me. I do believe that by comparing Brazil and the United States and focusing politics and economy, I found some new things, but this is not my hypothesis. But I'm going to narrate here what historians have found about these connections between slavery and death penalty. One interesting issue. For a long time, historians and sociologists in the United States have been sustaining the hypothesis that the permanence, like the survival of death penalty in the United States, it is a legacy from slavery. And I do believe they are partially right, because I do believe the death penalty survived in some states because there was this demand for the control of the black criminal. That's how they would say it. So I do believe there is some connection. But if we take their argument seriously, if the legacy of slavery explains why the death penalty was not abolished in the United States, how do we explain Brazil? Brazil abolished the death penalty. In our constitution to this day, the death penalty is there exclusively during war periods, during state of exceptions, to bring back Samuel into the picture. So it is there, but formally it is not, because Brazil hasn't been in a real war since the Second World War, since the First World War, and it wasn't really effective, like the death penalty was not used by them. So the last time a person was hanged in Brazil, it was in 1876. And in the 1870s, this was a rare case. In the 1860s, they were declining. In the 1850s, they were declining, and they disappeared after the 1870s, and the Constitution and the criminal codes for the Republic regime later abolished the death penalty exclusively. They only allowed it in war periods. So how do we explain that? What I try to say is, and this is interesting. First of all, in the 18th and even worse, in the 1860s, Brazil realized, Brazilian government, Brazilian politicians, Brazilian elites realized Brazil was really close to become the last slave country in the Americas. And there was a problem there, because Brazil presented itself internationally by being a monarchy as a more civilized nation than the Spanish American republics. So Brazil was worried about its international image. So whenever slavery declined in the United States, not declined, it ended after the Civil War, Brazilian government immediately was trying to solve that problem, because it was clear slavery needs to end, because if not, Brazil is going to be an international pariah. So it was fundamental to avoid that. But in the 1850s and 1860s, Brazilian economy was completely dependent on slavery, and most politicians, I would say more than 90% of Brazilian politicians, they were slaveholders themselves. All their money was in like plantations and enslaved people. So this was something that the political elites would not solve on their own. So that is a moment when the emperor himself, this is not to say that Dom Pedro was this like beautiful person that, no. He wasn't fighting slavery, he was just fighting the death penalty. And as a strategy, that's what I'm trying to say. Like, this was not only him, but part of Brazilian political elite and part of the justice system elite, like the judges and those who would get to the higher courts. They realized that if Brazil was internationally judged for having slavery, but Brazil was following the steps of penal reform by abolishing, at least pragmatically, the death penalty, this was a way of compensating this international discourse that would isolate Brazil. And this was an initiative of few people, but few powerful people within the state institutions. Because the emperor, whenever anyone in Brazil was sentenced to death, immediately this person had the right not only to go to the higher courts of the country, trying to change that decision, the sentence, but they could write what we call petição de graça, which is pardon. They would ask for pardon for the emperor. And this is interesting. After the 1850s, more in the 1860s, and absolutely in the 1870s, the emperor would not pardon them. And this is important. What they would do was commute the penalty. So it wasn't the death penalty. it was what they call galés perpétuas, what was like prison for life with labor in the streets of the cities. So saying that Brazil was not as violent because the death penalty wasn't there, but permanent like punishment with labor in the street, like this is nonsense. But it was politically effective in many ways, because the emperor would use that, and also part of the political elite. See how civilized Brazil is? We don't kill anyone. The state doesn't kill anyone. And at the same time, slaveholders would, whenever the political crisis of slavery came in the 1870s and the 1880s, the slaveholders started like asking the death penalty to return, because they thought only the death penalty would control enslaved people. And there were interesting cases, a lot of interesting cases, in which enslaved people killed the overseers, got like the labor instruments, and went to the city, like fighting anyone on their way, and presenting themselves at the police saying, I committed a crime, I prefer to be arrested. I prefer prison for life as a galé than the death penalty. And because of these episodes that statistically, they don't show anarchy, but they are interesting, at least symbolically, because of this phenomena, the slaveholders started pressuring the emperor to stop this policy that wouldn't allow the death penalty to be put into practice. And what is interesting is, by the end of monarchy, so like this policy disappears because Brazil is no longer a monarchy. But then the new constitution and the new penal code, the new criminal code, abolishes the death penalty. And at first, this was not used in discourse, but then in the 1900s and the 1910s, when lynching news coming from the US would spread through Brazilian press, that is when politicians started saying, see, we are the better version of a post-slavery society. The United States never solved racial relations. That's why they have lynching. That's why they have so much violence. Brazilians have created, they wouldn't say by then racial democracy yet, they would say fraternity and a racial paradise. So Brazil created a possibility for Black and white people to live together, and the state doesn't punish anyone. And whenever in the 1850s, the civil rights movement became strong in the United States, in Brazil, whites would say, see, this is a problem. Black people are fighting back. This is good. In Brazil, our Black people don't fight back. Of course they would. The Black movement in Brazil, Frente Nacional, later Movimento Negro Unificado, they would fight. But in the official discourse from the state, it was easy to say it wasn't happening because it wasn't as strong in Brazil. And because this ideology that said Brazil is not racially violent, it had some support from most Brazilian society. Because since lynching wasn't happening in every corner, and since the death penalty was not like hanging specifically Black people, and most Black people who were arrested were brought into prisons, isolated from society, how can you say this is racial violence? No, they were arrested because they were like bad guys. They were committing crimes, they're criminals. So Brazil actually, in my opinion, was more effective in controlling freed population after abolition than the US, because they would do so without saying it was racial, but doing it anyway, the same way they always did. In the 19th century, slaveholders in Brazil would say, oh, slavery, it is so bad, like it's such a bad thing that we got from the colonial period, but what can we do? It is here, but one day it will end. In the United States, since abolitionism was really strong since the early 19th century, slaveholders needed to defend slavery as something good, as a positive good. This is good, and there is racial superiority, and this is important. Brazil created the perfect scenario by denying historically slavery and then denying historically racism. Brazil has been the longest slave territory in America. Brazil has been the longest racist region in the Americas. And Brazil is the country that presents itself as a racial democracy. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, but you know, the positive criminologists in Brazil, they openly said that the métissage was a criminogenic problem in our society in the beginning of the 20th century. and there was juridical thinkers in the first decades of the 20th century in Brazil that has no shame to say that to have black people on the streets was a problem for civilizing Brazilian society, and there was a racist speech, and this racist speech has supported projects of penal institutions and penal colonization strategies of colonization of the society, and not they had no success to how can I say, to implement in the juridical texts racist laws, but there was the criminological societies, there was criminological meetings that defended racist speech, and institutions to arrest potential criminals, which we know that was black people. And no, it's difficult to say that it was only that racism in Brazil was made in silence. There was, there are texts, public texts, in which they inscribed this kind of politics, this kind of thing. I don't know how do you think about it?
So you're absolutely right, and this is something I'm trying to talk about in my last chapter that I'm writing right now, which is, for instance, Nina Rodrigues is publishing a book called like Races and Criminality in Brazil. So the same movement from intellectuals, especially in criminology, and people from the legal system trying to control black people, this is openly racist, especially because the vocabulary that came from this racial sciences was racial. So they were doing that in Brazil. What is interesting is, of course, I'm trying to summarize like 200 years and that I simplify too much in the way I'm talking. What is interesting is, at this period, Brazil had this whitening ideology, which meant also people from Brazilian intellectual elites believed that white was better, like the white race was superior, but differently from the US, the solution, it wouldn't be necessarily segregation. It could be the idea of assimilation. Of course, Nina Rodrigues doesn't want that. He's against that. And many of these intellectuals, they're against that. But there are some people who are defending the idea that if Brazil mixes itself a lot, eventually black people will disappear. So Brazil, for a short period, developed this ideology of whitening that was at the same time a supremacist ideology, but an assimilationist ideology. If we mix a lot, black people will disappear. That's not what most people in criminology are saying. You're absolutely right. They were saying black people, and especially mixed people, they are even worse than black people, and they need to be controlled because there is this criminality is a result from mixing itself. What I find interesting is not the fact that this discourse existed. It did, and this discourse is still framing institutions nowadays. If we go to any police station, they still have the specific target they follow. What is interesting is that this open discourse was happening in Brazil and in the United States at the same time. And then it goes on in the United States and it becomes more explicitly framing the laws, but also framing the public discourse of politicians. Politicians would say, we need to control black people openly in the 1820s, 1830s, 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. What happens in Brazil? This whitening ideology, it was substituted eventually by the racial democracy ideology. And by then, these technologies that control Black people and mixed people, they survived, but they became silent. They were not public anymore. And what I find, like, this is a terrible topic, but I find it really interesting to understand, how is it possible that both countries had the same discourse at a certain time, and this discourse became so silent, and in my opinion, more effective in Brazil because of silence. I do believe silence was the most effective, because the discourse in the United States is also what allowed and made it more possible that Black movement became so strong. No Black person in the United States doesn't know they're Black. So resistance is also a consequence of an explicit racism. In Brazil, where supposedly no one is a racist, it's always my neighbor, it's never me. The consequence of that is that fighting racism is also more difficult. So I agree with you, you're absolutely right. The racial discourse was in Brazil by then, and it framed our institutions, but it was substituted by silence, and silence along with the racial harmony discourse that allows even our government nowadays, oh my God, to say, like, to use the same discourse from the 1930s. Brazil doesn't need racial policy because Brazil is a racial paradise. So you're absolutely right, it was there. And then in Brazil, it becomes more silent. Individuals might say it, specialists might say it, but most politicians, most authorities wouldn't. They would do it, but they wouldn't say it.
Yeah. Wow. Colleagues, you have more questions? So, Marcelo, if we have no more questions, oh, Angela.
Just a little comment. This racial policy is a diplomatic policy in Brazil since Casagrande Senzala was published as official, and still today, since then until today. So it's a strategy of the government to show the world how we have a racial democracy as a policy, a state policy. It's real. And I don't know, I would like to thank Marcelo for the presentation. Just this comment, but I don't know if the colleagues would like to ask something else.
Yes, just a little question, like references. I wanted to know if you had some references about this Northern American penal colonies, which is quite interesting. And the reference from Angela Davis, and she worked like something like race and prison, something. I don't know. I don't remember the exact title, so I just wanted this to little information. And thank
you so much. Sorry. No. First, Angela, I would agree completely with you. Like, and it's interesting. This is a recent reading I've been doing. When Casagrande and Senzala was published, since it fought the whitening ideology, by then even Black people used Casagrande Senzala as trying to defend the idea that Brazil could become a racial democracy. So even the Black movement by then used this idea. The problem is Casagrande Senzala was turned into the perfect weapon, and not only by Vargas regime and the military dictatorship in Brazil, and now to our government, but also to Salazar regime in Portugal and the way they would intervene in Africa, the Lusotropicalismo, as they would say. So yes, like Casagrande Senzala begins as a problematic study, but by then it was partially progressive and used by Black people, and it was completely turned over, and it became the perfect ideology, or the perfect weapon for a modern ideology. Samuel asked me about my references. Honestly, Samuel, most of my references during the process of building the research itself and my methodology, they're historians that have been studying slavery. That's how I started. But as I said, at the same time I was studying history, I took the social science course in parallel. And by doing so, I got really interested by the sociology of punishment, and there especially Michel Foucault, but also Russian Pirsheimer, Luc Vacan, Pavarini, and also all the other classics that I think you guys know better than I do. But also how the new carceral studies, especially in the United States, were building on these previous theories to build a new repertoire to analyze modern violence and especially racial violence. And that's where Angela Davis enters the picture as well, as much as Elizabeth Hinton, Michelle Alexander, and it's interesting how Black feminism became really strong in this field. So that's something fundamental for me. But when it comes to Brazil, this is all like, and if I actually focus on the US, I would need to return and talk about like Du Bois and Ida Wells in the early 20th century, which were the first ones from the Black movement, also fighting academically, building their intellectual tools. But this is about the United States. I would say that in Brazil, there is like a major field of research, especially connected to the Black movement and carceral studies that I have been following. I would say that most of the courses I had in the University of São Paulo, the history of prison with Laurindo Dias Minotto, but also Marcos Alvarez and like the sociology, I think the sociology of prison, something like that. And all these readings about not only the intellectual traditional references, but recent studies that analyze incarceration, police brutality, state of exception, and criminal and organized crime in the peripheries, like the Primeiro Comando da Capital. I think I've been reading a lot about that. And what I try to do is to inspire myself in the way the sociology of punishment and the sociology of prison analyze the history of prison itself and modern violence to understand, okay, everyone says slavery and the legacy of slavery is fundamental to understand violence. But most people don't draw the connections through time. How slavery in the 19th century changed for the late 19th century, how it changed for the early 20th century. It is easy to say slavery, mass incarceration, and there is a connection. What I try to do is a little bit more carefully analyze not only prison, but violence, not only state violence, especially state violence, but connected to social violence and especially elite violence, and how all of this was, it was framed and it changed within a slave society in the 19th century, and how its legacy prevailed after abolition. Not necessarily coming to the late 20th century, because other people are doing that with much more capacity and readings and knowledge than I do. But I thought I could help building a bridge. And that's what I'm trying to do still.
Otávio, last words?
Just thanks so much, Marcelo, for the masterclass that we had with you, and it was very impressive presentation, and I'm sure that all of us and the people who are listening were very enlightened with all the things that you brought here today. Thank you.
I think I'm the one who needs to thank you all. I think we all do research, and it is always important to say out loud what we are writing, because it doesn't make as much sense unless you can explain to other people. If it's only written, you're not actually communicating it well. And the opportunity of presenting to you all is great. Your questions allow me to reframe some of my ideas, not being so radical in the oppositions between the United States and Brazil, as Otávio reminded me, like being careful in this comparison. And it is really good to be with you all. I hope I can be in other presentations, now listening much more than talking. And it was a pleasure to be with you all.
Well, thank you, Marcelo. Before ending the broadcast, I would like to invite you and the audience to our next meeting. That will be 5 November with Catherine Benoit, Nécropolitique aux frontières ultramarines françaises, Maroni, Canal du Mozambique et Méditerranée. It's a guest very expected here for us, and It will be perfect if you could join us this day more well. And if you have no more questions or no more information, I can end the broadcast. Samuel, sorry.
Yes, I just wanted to add, and for everybody who is listening to us, that yes, Catherine is a great colleague. She's an anthropologist from Connecticut College, but French origin, and she has a very complete scope about how much Caribbean, but also American colonial world is so much separated, segregated, and she dedicated all her research, and now it's the result of a research life, which is going to be told on this next talk, and yes, it's going to be a great moment for us. I hope so. So yes, I invite you very, very warmly to join us, and Catherine is a great also talker and very good friend. So come on, thank you, and thank you again, Marcelo, for this.
Thank you, all my friends.
All right, that's it, and see you in the next meeting.